Hello, I'm Valeria Martinez. I recently graduated this semester. My senior seminar class focused on the history of riots within America, and where I got inspiration to start this essay actually began last year during the fall 2020 semester when I was taking a history of immigration class. And within that class, we brushed upon this, and I felt like expanding upon this for my research paper this year. The Chinese massacre of 1871 began all with a woman and two rival faction leaders. The woman went by the name of Yahit, and she was a renowned prostitute who was valued at around $2,500, which is the equivalent of 50,000 in today's money. She brought Yo Hing, he was the one who owned her at the time, decent revenue, up until she was kidnapped by a rival faction leader called Sam Yoon. Once news reached Yo Hing that Yahit was kidnapped, he took her to court under the accusations that she had stolen a lot of jewelry from him. However, because the courts were typically not in favor towards the Chinese communities, uh, the rival faction leader Sam Yoon was able to pay her bail and essentially come under possession of her. Uh, Not liking this, the rival leader Sam Yoon he ordered a hit on Yo Hing. It failed. The assassination failed, and Yo Hing in return declared war against him. Realizing that tensions were on the rise, some well-intentioned Chinese members had warned officers and authority to stay away from the area on the day of October 24th, 1871. However, when the fighting actually began late in the evening, around like 5 to 7 p.m., three officers that were in the area responded to the noises of gunfire, hoping to put an end to it. However, they got caught in the crossfire, and some Anglo Americans who were within the area, one of them by the name of Robert Thompson, also was caught in the crossfire not trying, but he was shooting at the Chinese. And however, one of them managed to shoot him above the heart, fatally wounding him until he eventually passed away in a drugstore nearby. And once news spread of this attack, a mob of Anglo Americans and not Mexican Americans, I'm sorry, Hispanics marched towards Chinatown and essentially began to hunt down all the Chinese men who were responsible for the shooting, and they managed to trap them down in the colonnade abode, which is actually pictured right here. They dragged them out, and once they were able to drag them out, they began to beat and lynch them. The result of all of this was a total of 19 Chinese dead, some of which were not even the original gunmen, but just other innocent Chinese members in the community around the area. There were also reports, unfortunately, of a young 10-year-old boy who had taken part in the massacre, shouting for more Chinese men to be taken out so they could kill them, if that wasn't already worse enough. Now, for some background, Los Angeles during the 1800s was not what it is today. It was more like a backwater town, and the Chinese community within Los Angeles at the time of the massacre was only around like 200 to 300 Chinese members living within Chinatown and the surrounding areas. A lot of it could be associated with racial prejudices, and these racial prejudices stemmed from various things such as the First Opium War and prostitution. The First Opium War, which occurred in 1879 within China, began when Britain began trading opium as a luxury item to China. However, if many of you are familiar with it, uh, this resulted in the rapid uprising of opium dens and addiction issues among China. And in an attempt to stop the opium addiction from damaging the Chinese any further, one of the Chinese government officials seized the ports that had all the opium in it and forcefully destroyed them in public. However, when news of this reached Britain, um, Britain demanded that China pay a hefty reimbursal for all the opium that they lost. And when China refused, they went to war to each other. And the war lasted up until 1842 when Britain finally defeated China and they were forced to sign the Treaty of Nanjing, which essentially gave up a couple of ports and a section of Hong Kong to foreign countries so they could continue trading within China. However, in the aftermath of this as well, aside from the news of the opium and addiction spreading to America, it damaged the image of Chinese severely, along with the prostitution. So, one of the stories of prostitution, which occurred during the gold rush, occurred with a woman by the name of Ah Toy. She came to America with her husband, hoping to come to the Golden Mountain, which is the name that many Chinese gave to California during the gold rush period. However, in the middle of her journey, her husband had passed away of some unknown illness that greatly weakened his body. And when by the time Atoy arrived, she was left alone. And realizing that she had no other option, and she realized like, oh, I'm beautiful. She decided to turn to prostitution, and what she essentially did was she bought herself a little shack where she would put on like peep show performances uh, to people who would pay her for her shows. And it did really well. She had lines going around a couple of blocks of men just trying to get a glimpse of her during one of her peep shows. And the amount of money that she brought in eventually allowed her to buy a brothel and a couple more exotic beauties, as they were called, to be a part of it. Because at the time there was this attraction towards the exotic mystery. There was also an issue where the Chinese had begun to be compared with the African American communities. Uh, the Chinese were referred to as Celestial John, and in the same manner that the African Americans were referred to as Sambo, which basically described a docile and loyal servant who was unfortunately prone to bouts of stealing, and both regardless were seen as servile to the Anglo-Americans. How they were referred to in the newspaper was no better, being referred to as Chinaman, which was a derogatory term used in the time. I know it's not prominent, but the images themselves did not help the issue as well, portraying them as animalistic. In this one right here from Thistleton Jolly Chan, uh, it depicts the Chinese going from monkey to Chinaman and then later to pig. The reason they were so often dehumanized in the images was done in the same manner that the Native Americans were, was the intent to demonize them, which is more apparent in one of the political cartoons called The Question of the Hour. And quite literally, they were drawn as demon. And in this image, Colonel Sam struggles with the issue on what to do with the Chinese and how to get them out of America. And the only thing holding them back was the Geary Act, which essentially, the Geary Act in this case being what extended the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, I believe. Economic tensions played a role as well uh, during the gold rush. Specifically was when these signs first came into view, as multiple cultures came into contact with each other in the hopes of gaining uh, wealth from the gold that they scavenged. I'm sorry, mined. Uh, the Coolie Trade Program also proved to be one of the underlying factors between the economic tensions and also some of the racial tensions that would later spark the massacre. The Coolie Trade Program was essentially a program between China and America that helped provide cheap labor to America during the time that the transcontinental railroad system was being constructed. And this caused a lot of labor competition because of the fact that the Chinese could be hired less than Anglo Americans. and it didn't help the Chinese, and it didn't really help the Americans either, that the Chinese were willing to take on more dangerous jobs that no one else wanted to, which of course also put the Chinese higher up in the desirability because they could be hired for less and they would be more willing to do the dangerous work. This, as a result, sparked feelings of nativism, which, as a result, regulations were made to favor Anglo Americans over other ethnicities from Chinese, African Americans, and Hispanics and other uh, people of color during the time period, as well as the fact that the Chinese were banned from earning claims, these claims being from their earnings during the gold rush, and they also had to pay a foreign miners tax. The foreign miners tax was established mainly to prevent some of the gold from being taken out of America, but it was mainly targeted towards the Chinese, especially, who had to pay a heavy sum around like 20%. And in all of this, how was Los Angeles impacted? They actually weren't impacted negatively. They were impacted pretty positively. They experienced a booming economy, and they turned from a backwater town to a bustling city, uh, as they reaped in the benefits from both the gold rush and the Chinese immigrant workers who immigrated there to live, uh, who then built up a chain of stores from restaurants, laundromats, and like minor trading companies that help bring in economy as well. The land especially proved to be valuable, opening up advertisement for health resorts, agriculture, and local commodities such as wine. The anti-Chinese movement as well, in which many people believe that the cheap Chinese labor undervalued white labor as a result because of the fact that they could be hired for less. Many white Americans feared it would lead to an increase in white prostitution. And while prostitution is not really something that many want to, is a job that not many would like to fall under. It was more in the sense that they hated it because of the fact that it meant white Americans, especially white women, would be in a servile position to other uh, ethnicities typically viewed as beneath them, in this case being Chinese, African, Hispanics, and the other ones that were in Los Angeles at the time. Uh, Newspapers also emphasized the infamous reputation of Calle de los Negros in Chinatown, which gained an infamous reputation because of all the uh, gambling dens, the opium dens, the addiction, and the fights that would constantly go on. Not constantly, but that would frequently go on within the area. And it was even bashed in political cartoons from the Wasp, which was a weekly newspaper that voiced discontent with the government, railroad monopolies, and Chinese immigration. When Chinese immigrants immigrated to America, not many of them were intending to be stereotyped, and not many were intending to stay here for long. But those that did banded together and minimized contact with other ethnicities to avoid being persecuted by those that didn't like them. The resulting conflicts mainly stemmed from issues with assimilation. Because of the fact that many Chinese never intended to stay long, many intended to just come to America, work for a bit, and then go back to China where they could retire and live in luxury for the rest of their lives. However, despite that, it was not only the fact that not many Chinese only intended to stay for a couple of years, but also the fact that there were a whole bunch of laws against the Chinese legalization in America that made it extremely difficult for them to stay within America for long periods of time, especially if they intended to settle and live there with their families. Conflicts also stemmed from differences in culture, which became exceedingly apparent during the gold rush and during the construction of the transcontinental railroad, because the coolie program isolated Chinese workers from others, not only because of the fact that they could be hired for cheap, but because of their appearances and language comprehensions. Many Chinese workers, railroad workers during the time, dressed as you see right here. The men wore coats and their features and their hats. The language comprehension, especially, though they could speak uh, English pretty decently, it was like more basic terms that they were allowed to say. And if they were able to speak it well, many of them still had really strong accents that affected their communication. Like I stated before, many of them took on dangerous work when building the railroad. trauma and injury were common both from work-related injury and violence that they experienced from the Anglo-Americans. This was because many of them were willing to do to plant the bombs and light them when it was time to make like clear paths for the railroads. And there was a study done, especially on two skeletons from Carlin Cemetery, where two skeletons belonging to Chinese men from this time period were analyzed, and one of them was revealed to have died from work-related trauma, either being crushed by rubble or caught in an explosion, while the second one was found to have been not from work-related injuries, but from blunt force trauma, where he was most likely attacked in the back of the head and killed on the spot because of the cracks that they found on the side of the skull, leading from the back to the front of the face. As a result of this as well, from the jobs that they took on, injury and sickness treatments were treated differently as well. One of the leading medicines that the Chinese preferred was opium, which was used more as a morphine substitute, a cough suppressant, and treatment for diarrhea at the time, compared to the tonics that many American miners preferred to take. However, of course, because of the fact that opium was already negatively associated with them, it only added more towards the fact that, like, oh, the Chinese are addicts. Look at them still taking opium when there are all these other alternatives available. If not for opium, it was also the consumption of snakes, which was not only a popular snack at the time, but it was also treated as a cure-all for colds, sore throats, seizures, poor visions, and other ailments that they experienced at the time. Uh, it also did not help that the violence among the Chinese began to rise in the 1870s, and outrage sparked that the Chinese didn't belong in America with their heathen customs because of the fact that not so much because of the fights, but because of the fact that the Chinese refused to rely on the law to settle their issues, and they preferred to handle it independently on their own, which I get into a little later. The Berlin Game Treaty, signed in 1868, was probably another cause of the conflicts between the Chinese and Anglo Americans within Los Angeles, as the fact that uh, the treaty promised free and open immigration between China and the US, more so for the Coolie program, but also for others coming into America at the time, which is insinuated that the Chinese didn't need to assimilate because of the lack of legalization laws that were that were listed in the treaty. And P.W. Dooner warned that the Chinese would take over the United States after the treaty was signed in his book, The Last Days of the Republic. Like I stated a while ago, the Chinese handled their conflicts independently from the law, and this was mainly because the Chinese believed the law would not help them. They preferred to uphold their honor and reputation themselves, and they felt that the law would not understand uh, the intricacies of their culture and their community hierarchies that they had within Chinatown. And this was only emphasized during an incident in December 22nd of 1870 when Xing Yu, a famous prostitute, was arrested by police. Once news spread that she was arrested, many members in the Chinese community rallied together using vigilante actions to get her back from the police with weapons, guns, whatever they had at their disposal. And though they were able to get her back from the police, this only added to the stereotyping that the Chinese were violent for the Anglo Americans. Not only this incident, but there was another case that was taken to court called the People versus Hall, in which the Chinese or any person of color were not allowed to testify against or for Anglo American defendants. So, was the Chinese massacre of 1871 a result of vengeance? No. It was more the result of anti-Chinese sentiments and racialized violence due to the preconceived notions that they had about them because of the opium, the prostitution, and their violence, as well as prejudice towards them because of the fact that the Chinese, well, not the fact, but that many felt that the Chinese were taking away job opportunities from them. If Robert Thompson really was the spark, his death was either a spark or an excuse to attack. But if it was about vengeance, that was not the case. Otherwise, many would have stopped after the original Chinese gunmen were killed, and they wouldn't have gone after the innocents. But because they used his death as an excuse to attack the members in the Chinese community and others in Chinatown, the end result was 19 dead and approximately between $30,000 to $70,000 stolen from the Chinese community. Now, this is, of course, not to say that all of the Anglo Americans wanted to attack the Chinese at the time. There were reports that some Anglo Americans invited the Chinese into their homes to escape the massacres that were going on if they were not able to escape the borders of LA in time. But ultimately, the massacre ended with 19 dead.
Well, thank you so much. That was a great presentation.
Yeah,
Thank
great
you.
job, Valeria. And you presented your information. It was fascinating. I've always heard about the Chinese massacre, but to hear the whole story of the people involved.
It's a little funny because during my research, I wasn't able to find that much information on the massacre itself. It was almost like it was brushed under the rug.
Yeah.
And my main source of information for this was only from one other historian by the name of Scott Zetch, who was my main source of inspiration for this as well.
There was one other book I read recently, Eternity Street.
Yes, that one as well.
Yeah, that went into pretty good depth on it as well. Yeah. Valeria, this is from Veronica Martinez. Valeria, what made you decide to cover this topic, even though you don't have a lot of sources to rely
on? My inspiration came mainly last semester during my history of immigration in America. One of my professors, her name was Donna Binkowitz, and there was a day where we held a class on specifically Chinese immigration to America, where we went over both the Coolie Program, the Geary Act, and the Chinese Exclusion Act that affected Chinese immigration to and from America during that period of time. And though we only brushed up on it did interest me. So when the time came for me to choose a topic for my presentation this year for my research paper, I remembered my interest in the Chinese Exclusion Act and everything that was done to prevent Chinese immigration in America. And by chance, I came upon the Chinese Massacre of 1871 from a newspaper article written by, it was Scott Zetch. And it wasn't a newspaper, it was a journal article written by him.
Ariana asks, since you mentioned it was hard to find sources on the topic, do you think that there might be more to the massacre than you found?
Oh, I would definitely say so, because at the time period when the massacre broke out, as it was being reported into the newspapers the following days, though a lot was mentioned on how many of the Chinese had died, a lot of the information that, like the intricacies, such as the involvement of the 10-year-old boy shouting for, bring out more Chinese so we could lynch them, or just the severity itself of the massacre was not as publicized as it was later on. Most of the research really that I got for the Chinese massacre itself was very little primary sources and came more as secondary sources that were written 10 to 20 years after it was written.
Mm-hmm.
And there was even a newspaper article at the time that kind of confirmed that Los Angeles was trying to sweep the history of that massacre under the rug.
Also, Edward Sell asks, did the Chandlers and the LA Times have any influence on the hostility towards the Chinese?
I would definitely say so, because of how many of the Chinese were presented in newspaper articles, either as violent drug addicts, gang members. Of course, not helped by the fact that well, not many, but there were Chinese gangs, prominent Chinese gangs at the times, around Chinatown, who were responsible for owning like a couple of opium dens, gambling dens, and the prostitutes themselves as well.
There are a couple of questions for you in the chat here too. One is, did you reach out to the Chinese American Museum in Los Angeles?
I actually did not. It didn't occur to me until after I was done with my research that that was also an option.
And here is an interesting question for you. Were you all at all inspired by the recent anti-Asian American events? Your paper is pretty timely and a reminder that not much seems to have been different in 2020, 2021.
It actually was. Once I found out that, well, not once I found out, but when all the news started breaking out about all the attacks going on towards the Asian Americans, it reminded me. I saw a lot of similarities between that and the beginnings of my research was the Chinese massacre. I began to see similarities, and that only inspired me to push forward with the subject. So yes, I was inspired by the recent events earlier this year